All right, we're going to get started on segment 2 of class 1. From the start, the primary focus of budgeting was about accountability. And it's helpful to look at accountability in at least two different ways, in terms of being responsible to whom and being responsible for what. We'll take a look at three general eras of public budgeting practice and reform, and we'll finish with a look at the role professional organizations play in fostering best practices. Since the adoption of the Constitution and throughout the 19th century, legislative control of the budget meant no separation of powers. By the beginning of the 20th century, economic conditions spurred calls for budget reform, emphasizing the need for a clearer implementation of the concept of separation of powers, which more firmly established the executive budget system. I know this concept might sound kind of odd, but the thinking here is that a president who has full control of the bureaucracy can then be held accountable by Congress for actions taken by that bureaucracy. Interestingly, the adoption of the 1963 Anne Arundel County Charter was largely driven by a similar call for a separation of powers. So here in the report by the Charter Committee to the people before they voted for an approval of this charter, this was a statement they made. The political experience of Anne Arundel County and the need to overcome the defects of the dual role now assigned to the Board of County Commissioners points to a structure in keeping with our traditions, the separation of powers. It is proposed to have at the head of each branch the elected representative or representatives of the people, designated by them, responsible to them, and removable by them. Each branch, legislative and executive, has a clearly defined scope of activity, and each balances and constrains the other in the best traditions of American government. So I just think it's neat that we see on the national level this move towards an executive budget system, and we see a similar need for that being expressed at the local level. So now let's move on to the responsible for what. The focus of this first era is understandable since the Constitution was explicit about taxing power, but not so much when it comes to the nature of governmental expenditures. However, as the public sector grew in size, concerns over the accountability of expenditures also rose. And this happened kind of in three general stages. First, the legislative bodies exercise their control over the executive in the form of line item appropriations. In other words, the focus was initially on the input side. You can only spend so much on this labor and on this type of contract or whatever. Then came the management stage, which emphasized efficiency. In other words, output measures were added to the mix. Third came increased concern with planning functions. In other words, a focus on outcomes over a longer period of time. With each stage, the amount of information required and the complexity of that information increased significantly. This challenged both human and system capacities to effectively use it. And this gave rise to two competing public decision-making models: the relational comprehensive model You may have heard of Herbert Simon or Anthony Downs. They were kind of thinkers in that reign. And incremental, the incremental model. Charles Lindblom and Aaron Wildavsky were proponents of that model. There were various approaches since 1960s to budgetary reforms, and beyond that, the promise hasn't really materialized. In addition to excerpts from my public budgeting systems textbook that I've been showing you, I've also provided you with 2 academic articles related to these reform efforts, over 80 pages long. I've also provided you with shorter excerpt versions, about 10 pages. None of that is required reading. The next 2 slides present highlights from each of these articles, which basically support the concepts and history presented just now. That is, that the various approaches to improve budgeting since the 60s pretty much represent a repackaging of the same concepts. The first academic article represents a fairly comprehensive historical review highlighting the improvements, disappointments, and works in progress. This particular article jumped out at me because a classmate of mine who went on to get his PhD actually co-wrote this particular article. This assessment of the reforms of the past decade and its assertion that future progress lies less in the measurement of outputs and outcomes and more on an understanding of political processes and players seems to be reflective of the incremental model as opposed to the rational comprehensive model of public budgeting. Reading this also seems to validate my chosen approach to this short course because it focuses on the roles of self-interests of each player in the process, particularly citizens, politicians, and bureaucrats. Now, I'm going to get a little personal here. As a grad student, and in my early years as a public budgeting professional, I was an avid proponent of the works of rational, comprehensive model thinkers like Herbert Simon and Anthony Downs. I couldn't wait to play my part in fixing government through the application of rational systems like performance-based budgeting with the aid of modern information technologies. But as I progressed throughout my career, I came to see and experience the real-world wisdom associated with the incremental model thinkers like Aaron Wildavsky and Charles Lindblom, who wrote articles like The Science of Muddling Through. I just love that term. While much of their work focused on the federal level, it is easily applied to the state and local levels as well. The second academic article is an essay on the work of Aaron Wildavsky, prepared by the Naval Postgraduate School in 1994. Both of these articles invoked the same core question posed by V.O. Keyes back in 1940. I never heard him speak, but this critique was apparently characteristic of Wildavsky's ability to turn a phrase. I appreciate snark, even if I'm on the receiving end. It kind of reminds me of my former boss of over 20 years, who you'll all meet tomorrow or the next day. As I admitted just a few moments ago, this was a bitter pill for me to swallow. It's not always about being right, even if you really are. While I like this particular quote, for me, its meaning remains the same, but better fits me and my perspective when read this way. Those who wish to understand the budget must acquaint themselves with politics if they want to know what is going on. Here I'm just going to illustrate some of the budget reform buzz. When I was working for the city of Berkeley, California, this book was all the rage. We were encouraged to view citizens as customers, and performance-based budgeting was all the rage. The inspiration for the Government Performance and Results Act of 1993 was the comprehensive performance-based management and budgeting system used by the city of Sunnyvale, California. And I'm going to play this video here that is a 15-second YouTube video blurb on this showing the pomp and circumstance that surrounded this. Sunnyvale was the envy of budget professionals like me. But I started to see the cracks in the armor when a colleague of mine who used to work for the city of Sunnyvale confessed to me that when the city needed to make significant budget reductions, as all cities had to in the early 1990s, they initiated across-the-board flat percentage reductions to all departments, rather than using their program performance budget approach of identifying the quantity of service delivery products they wanted and then budgeting the amount driven by the product cost rate schedules. I don't mean to disparage the city of Sunnyvale. Their budget process is exemplary, just not as much as the hype might suggest. This article from the Governing Magazine makes this point 25 years later. It's a real interesting read. Ditto with respect to the recent City of Baltimore budget model. Then Budget Officer Andrew Klein has since moved on, and this budget system is now a shadow of its former self, just a few years later. It's a common thing. He's come in, he's going to save the world, and then peters away as leadership changes. Another quote from Aaron Wildofsky: "Some butterflies were caught, no elephants stopped," highlighting the fact that systems like this oftentimes make improvements around the edges, but don't make the big changes that are sometimes needed to turn the ship. Here's another article on the illusion of outcome-based budgeting. This is a blog just a few years ago. Now, this guy is he's an advocate of performance budgeting. His argument is that it's difficult and you don't just jump to outcomes. Bottom line is, it's complicated and it takes resources to get it right. This kind of argument raises a legitimate question, and that is it worth the expense that's required to do it right? Now, the Government Finance Officers Association is probably the most influential professional standards body in the field today. They seem to be taking a balanced approach. While they're encouraging best practices, they seem to acknowledge the need for flexibility to honor local jurisdictions' unique values and histories. An important dose of reality is delivered in the earlier mentioned article, and I'll read this quote here, that budget evaluation standards often default to measures of process achievements because there is no objective information for judging results. These tests of procedures are not grand evaluations, but they cannot be swept away as being beneath our concern because our budget processes so frequently fail them. So this is their kind of list of measures of process achievements. It's not a real high bar to clear. When compared to the GFOA framework, this process achievement standard doesn't really seem that far off either. I'm not saying we shouldn't aspire to more and better, but we shouldn't lose sight of these basics as we pursue more sophisticated reforms. We're going to get more specific about these stages later today and at the start of class 2 and 3. There's nothing magic or set in stone about these 5 stages. It's just how I'm explaining it. Others may categorize it a bit differently, but this hits on all the component parts. For now, I want to emphasize the human relational skills and ethical responsibilities associated with each of these stages of the budget process. I'm just going to display my key words for each stage in silence. No discussion. That's going to come later. So, like I say, we're going to be discussing this over the next couple of days and can work questions around these keywords and ethical ways of being in each of these stages of the process in relation to the operating and the capital budget. Now we're going to look at 3 different dimensions of this 5-stage process. While each process relates to just one fiscal year, it takes a few years to complete each one, so there may be as many as 4 different processes going on at a time. The county charter and code establish some clear and unambiguous requirements, but there's still plenty of flexibility. And I'm going to focus on 5 categories of players: elected officials, appointed officials, other county employees, citizens, and others. So first, overlaying this 5-stage process with the time dimension. This chart shows all of the stages for one fiscal year's budget process. For example, fiscal 22 strictly runs from July 1 of calendar year 21 through June 30 of calendar year 22. 4 of the 5 stages must be completed before that July 1 start of the fiscal year. I've broken stages 1 and 5 into these 3 sub-stages each. The full process to complete takes about 37 months, about 3 years. This chart shows the associated overlap between multiple ongoing budget processes. So it's got the process for fiscal 22 shown up here, summarized here. But as we start 22, we're finishing up on 20 and we're in the midst of implementing fiscal 21. So it's just showing the overlap and the interrelationships between the different processes that we can get into in the future. This is primarily offered as a resource highlighting the specific county charter and county code subsections that set forth requirements pertaining to these different stages. Now this is an important slide, but it's highly subjective. It's overlaying on this 5-stage process the roles of the different players involved. It's subjective. It reflects my personal assessment based on my experience and subject to my biases. The point of emphasis here should be on the evaluation of what the proper role should be for each player along each stage of this process. This first slide represents what I think is the current state of affairs. The low, mid, high is just getting at the level of input and involvement this particular player has at this particular stage of the process. Now, the second slide highlights the areas where I think the current role can be improved. If it's increased from the status quo, it's highlighted in light green. If the role of this particular player at this particular stage is decreased, it's highlighted in light red. Again, in addition to being highly subjective, this is just an overview. The key players, their roles, and their different perspectives are the focus of Class 2 and 3. This is just kind of a framework for guiding our discussion and review moving forward. So, takeaways. Recognizing that no change in the process of budgeting is going to alter the essential character of the budgetary struggle for power and money to spend on constituent programs requires an understanding of the political incentives and the specific actors involved. So this re-emphasizes the importance of accountability in budgeting. Also, this brings us back to the role and ethic of citizenship. So I'm going to play for you now this video of Peter Levine talking about the role of citizens from back in 2014, actually before he finished writing the book that he recently published. And then we'll proceed to questions.